Yeah. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for coming. My name is Belle Cole, and I'm leading the ESP partnership. I want to welcome all of you to this new format. I did want to mention something that is very sad, but one of our beloved colleagues who's worked with us on fire and composting forever, Will Bax, died last week. And we're putting together a tribute for him. He was a true great contributor. He spoke to us in September. Just wanted everybody to know how sad we feel about that. And then I just wanted to review very, very briefly first I wanted to comment on the website, the MWPA revised website, which is quite good. And so if anyone wants to know more about the history of the PMR group and our goals and what we do and our agendas, just look under collaboration. And there we are. And it's a big service and it's very well done. But I did want to say that for those of you who don't know, that what we do is that ESP is a collaboration between fire authorities and climate and environmental organizations in Marin to mitigate the risk of wildfires. And we have a number of goals, which we can tell you about at another time. For the sake of moving ahead with this agenda, I just wanted to mention to everybody that if they have the minutes from October 19th, they should look at them, because we had three great presentations. Jason gave us a wonderful one on the Foundry, and we had two excellent presentations by Chris Karsten on biochar, and one on let's see, mulching. And so I just wanted to alert people to that. And then we can just move on to say that we have a meeting on the 14th of December, and we'll be back to you on that. And we're going to be looking at the Marin ESP guidelines, which have been reviewed by MWPA, and we're going to be talking to you about that. That's in December. And so I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and pass it on to Mark for this remarkable panel that they put together on prescribed burning. And we have, as a committee, have paid a lot of attention to this, and we're just absolutely delighted to have a chance to listen and participate. So thank you.
Thanks, Belle. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. We are waiting for one more panelist, but we'll give her a minute to join and get started without her. Go ahead and oh, wow, technology, sorry.
My heart goes out to you.
Maria, that's usually our line.
Yeah, right. Okay, so everyone can see this, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so hopefully everyone's in the right place. Oops. Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, so like I said before, Sasha is going to be joining us a little bit late, but she is the director of Audubon Canyon Ranch, or director of Fire Forward at Audubon Canyon Ranch. And then we also have Sherry Adams with us. She is the senior vegetation ecologist for Marin Municipal Water District. And then we also have Captain Jordan Reeser, who's the Marin County Fire Department captain. Chief Weber, who also is coming from the Marin County Fire Department. We have Cody Cifuentes Winter, who is the Senior Resource Management Specialist at Mid-Penn Open Space District. And then we also have Peter Nelson, who is an assistant professor at UC Berkeley. And then to get started, we'll just have Mark sort of contextualize the conversation for us today, and then we'll get into the questions for our experts.
Yeah, and first, let me thank all of our panelists for taking their time. Some of them are here in Marin and some of them are from elsewhere. So I really want to thank you for your time to support this panel discussion here in Marin. And also for our attendees, just to kind of give you a little bit of a layout how we're going. Most of the ESP meetings have not been in the webinar format, but we felt that with the panel discussion, it might be a little bit easier to do it in the webinar format. When we get to the Q&A, and we will do Q&A at the very end, we will bring everybody over as panelists, so we'll get into a more traditional style Zoom meeting. But if you have questions, you could, the Q&A feature is alive. And so we'll be able to monitor the Q&As that way. But also, if you want to just jot them down on some notes and save them for the end of the presentation, we'll get into that, that portion of it. And then we're still working on the logistics of getting Sasha into the meeting. So we're working on that. But while Maria works on that, I'll go through just the intro to set us up where we are. And, you know, and that's the thing about speaking to a group like this. I'm looking at the list of our attendees, and this is a well-informed group that we're speaking to. And so when I say that we live in a fire-adapted ecosystem, that's really not a statement I have to make to this group. This group knows that. And some of the ways that our ecosystem has become fire adapted is through the cultural burning of our indigenous peoples that lived in our area for far longer than we've ever lived here. And their practices and the way they managed the land is arguably far better than we've been doing it for the last couple of 100 years. And so we've interrupted that cycle in many ways. And by decreasing the cultural burning, by decreasing the prescribed fire, we have interrupted our ecosystem. We've also interrupted our ecosystem by our land management. And that's the fire suppression that we have been doing for over 100 years. And if you recall, a lot of the wildfire fire suppression, when it first started 110 years ago, wasn't necessarily to protect lives. It was to protect timber. And people often forget that timber was a valuable asset here in Marin. But if you need to look any further than Mill Valley, the name of Mill Valley, well, it's because there were mills to mill the timber that was logged in Marin. And a lot of it went over to San Francisco to help build San Francisco. So, you know, that really was what drove the fire suppression at that time. Wasn't necessarily for life. It definitely wasn't for maintaining our ecosystems. It was to protect timber. Next slide, please, Maria, if you get a chance. And then, you know, with our confidence in our suppression capabilities, we have been pushing people further and further into the wildland-urban interface, or beyond the wildland-urban interface and into the wildlands. And, you know, when we first started doing that, we had fuel conditions and the environment that we could actually suppress fire and be somewhat successful in protecting life and property. But now that we are seeing that dramatic change in the wildfire environment, we have made it much more, we are seeing it's much more difficult to protect that life. And the other side of the coin is where there's people, there's ignitions. So not only do we have more people in the way, we have more people causing ignitions, whether it's on purpose or it's on accident, or it's the infrastructure that supports those communities. Next slide. And then we know that the impacts of our fire suppression, and we're seeing it combined with climate change. And so our fire suppression has really increased the accumulations of fuels. It's helped to decrease the diversification of our fuels, or our vegetation. Maybe I should stop calling it fuel, but it's helped to decrease the diversification of our vegetation and our habitats. And you know, we're starting to see monocultures of habitat, and it's really not healthy for our area. And then we know what climate change has been doing on top of everything else. And again, this is such an informed group. I won't belabor the point. That way we can get quickly to our subject matter experts that we have on board. Next slide. And finally, it's taken a lot of things to come together to create the environment that we're in. And so there is no one size fits all solution. And so there are many solutions that we are, and many paths that we're going to have to go down in order to make our communities fire adapted. Home hardening and defensible space is just a couple of aspects. We also need to have the evacuation routes, because we've created that environment where we are in a position that we have to get people out of the way. And then we have our vegetation management, and there's lots of ways that we can perform vegetation management. And the one obviously we're talking about today is prescribed fire. And with that, I'll step out of the way and let Maria facilitate this with our subject matter experts.
Thank you, Mark. So we can get started with the questions now. We're going to start out with some of the basics of prescribed burning and then move on to challenges and concerns before we go over some of the case studies both inside of and outside of Marin County. So to begin, Peter, can you tell me a little bit more about the historic and current relationships with cultural burning?
Yeah, sure. So, historically, cultural burning was happening throughout California as well as a lot of the United States, or what is now the United States. Burning was a cultural practice that essentially was used to enhance what was on the landscape, to, make good on relationships with non-human beings that Native people have with different plants and animals and the landscape. And so it was essentially a tending or stewardship tool, along with a number of different other stewardship tools in this toolkit that people had to make more productive materials for tools, food sources that needed to be really stable and consistent throughout different years. And so fire was used in a lot of those different cases to essentially get rid of pests, to create disturbance so that plants would shoot up new shoots for, say like willow or hazel, where you get these nice long straight shoots. And those are really good regular materials for basketry. A lot of that new growth also attracts different animals as well, and so it creates habitat for animals, as well as food sources for people too. So it's this dynamic relationship that the use of fire creates. It also, again, reduces fuels, allows people to live in these different areas and be protected from wildfire, as well as, opens up areas so that you can see the game that you're hunting, as well as predators that might potentially, hurt you if you're not aware of those being around. If you think about historically grizzly bears and, many more mountain lions and other things that used to live in the state, protection and being able to, see what's around you and be aware of that was a really important factor in moving around the landscape. So, historically, as was mentioned, there's fire suppression, as well as a number of other factors that get in the way of Native people using fire, going back to the Spanish mission system, people being removed from the landscape and brought into the missions forcibly by the Spanish. And, but even with that, you have burning continuing on into the 1820s, like in the Sonoma Valley. Father Jose Altamira witnessed, the blackened hills in the Sonoma Valley as he was going and looking for a site for the last mission within the mission system, showing that Coast Miwok people were still active in some of these places that the missions hadn't, been really, involved in bringing people in. Basically the process of missionization started in the Marin Peninsula and moved up through Coast Miwok territory, and then, started to touch on Pomo and Wapo areas as well. But yeah, even in the 1820s, there was still some burning going on. So, in the early American period, we have, in the first session of the legislature, essentially fire suppression happening, fines or imprisonment for burning the prairie, specific language in these early laws prohibiting burning. You also have the introduction of invasive species and pathogens, ranching and farming and livestock that contribute to environmental degradation, timber, which was mentioned as well, mining and sedimentation, overhunting and harvesting, all of these different sorts of environmental impacts, including the creation of wilderness, and something that we think of as a very positive thing with the creation of our national parks and wildland areas and open spaces. But even within that, you have this embedded value for wilderness area that's separate from people separate from nature. And so that's somewhat problematic because that implies that we're going to have a hands-off approach in the management of these different areas, which accumulate all of these fuels. So again, taking a look at all of these things that have happened over time and not just looking at one individual factor or another, but this whole kind of package that comes in with colonialism in terms of impacting fire and indigenous people's role in stewarding tribal lands is an important perspective to have when you're talking about where we are today and the sorts of impacts that we're seeing, including climate change, which was driven by industrialization and colonialism that were going on, pretty much from the 16 and 1700s on through to the present, where it gets, really, really intensified. So today, we're in this position where a lot of cultural burning needs to be restored to the landscape. These practices in many different areas haven't been practiced for nearly a century or even 2 centuries, since these really, really early times when Native people were being removed and heavily impacted in our populations. And so in different ways, people have been involved with fire. My great uncle was in the California Department of Forestry for 40 years and had a career in that. People have been involved in prescribed burning. I've been learning prescribed burning practices through Audubon Canyon Ranches programs as well. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily cultural burning. I also talk a lot with other practitioners who are doing cultural burning around the state. A lot of that is happening in Northern California with some of the tribes up there along the Klamath River, as well as in Eastern California as well. And there's some really great news articles about those different efforts. But in some of these areas, especially along the coast of California, people are trying to restore these practices to the landscape after this very long history of colonization and separation from a lot of our different areas. So that's pretty much the state of things today. Tribes are working with agencies to ensure that tribal comment, goes into the planning process for burning. But much more could be done there, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. But I'll stop there in my comments.
Thank you, Peter. You perfectly just transitioned to the next question, actually. So cultural burning and prescribed burning can look quite different. How can we go about ensuring the goals and practices of tribes are included?
Sure, yeah. And I should mention, because I don't think I'd mentioned this before, but I am a tribal citizen of the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria. And I mentioned my great uncle. So he grew up at Tomales Bay, where my family is from, in Marin County. And so we're Coast Miwok. And, so I can't represent my tribe. I'm speaking in somewhat generalities, because I'm not an official tribal representative on this panel, but I do have experience working in this area and, can speak to these issues from that experience. So I just wanted to mention that, my family history in the county and, me trying to restore some of these practices in my own personal life, as well as how I, consult with my tribe and other agencies and do work in my professional capacity as a professor at UC Berkeley. And so we talk a lot about cultural burning and prescribed burning and the differences there. And, pretty much cultural burning is a type of prescribed burning. Prescribed burning is this big umbrella. And a lot of times what people think of prescribed burning is just kind of equating to, fuels reduction and fuels management. And it can be that. It can also have ecological benefits and consider habitat and burning for those benefits to plant and animal communities. So it's more about those different goals that are embedded in the type of burning that you're doing, and prescribed referring to the type of burning where, people are actively putting fire on the landscape in, really intentional ways. And then cultural burning as, a part of that is doing this type of prescribed burning for cultural reasons. So, for our traditional food sources, burning under oak woodlands to get rid of pests, like I mentioned before, burning for different cultural materials like basketry that we need, that needs to be burned in order to give us those really healthy materials for those purposes. So that's mainly the difference between cultural and prescribed burning. It can happen at many different scales, but it largely has to do with what your goals are and all of that. And, to ensure that tribes are included in that, tribal perspectives and cultural burning included in this conversation, it really comes down to tribal consultation. So agencies working with tribes in collaboration in order to have tribal comment or even tribal participation if that's something that's wanted. And it makes sense in that sort of a context with the projects that you're working with. But making sure that, like if you're burning a certain area and there's a sensitive resource that a tribe needs, either, it needs burning or, you don't want to burn it down, but you consider all of those different factors in the type of burning that you're doing, where you're doing it, and how that gets done. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter. Cody, do you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. Cody Cifuentes Winter. I'm a neighbor just to the south of everybody here. And that is, I work in San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz counties. We're in the process right now, my agency is on finishing up a prescribed burning program. And one of the first steps we really took, which was about 2 years ago, is we took a deep dive into our policies at our agency to just review to see where we need to update or if there's any gaps within that. And one of the first things I noticed was just the lack of discussion of our Native American tribes that are in the area. And so one of my first steps was to just update our policies to really start to fold in comments from the tribes in the area, and making sure that they had a place at the table. That's one of the things that we've been hearing mostly from the tribes in our area, is they just want a seat at the table. They want to be able to talk and to discuss with us. And so under our prescribed fire program that we're developing right now, there's multiple different objectives. And of those objectives, the number one for me at this time right now is cultural burning, is to allow that to be happening and getting their input. We've discovered through our interactions with our tribes, there's this sense sometimes that the tribes already know everything that needs to be known about the area, about the land that was historically theirs, about the different practices that they did, but they, and many times, are working with us and learning at the same time. And so this is a great opportunity to bring them in and for us to learn from them and them to learn from us.
Thank you very much, Cody. Next question, Sherry, can you discuss what it means to live in a fire-adapted ecosystem and tell us about some of the impacts on ecosystems of fire?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. I'm glad to be joining you today. I think both Mark and Peter did a great job of addressing this. I'll add the lens of sort of plant ecology and vegetation ecology. One way to think about it is that the plants tell us a story. The plants tell us about the history of a place. So we are in a place in Marin where there's trees, where the cones are glued shut with resin that opens up in a fire. And then inside that cone is a bract that keeps the seed from burning up. And when the fire comes, those seeds sort of rain down for the next few months. And we live in a place where there's shrubs that have right at the ground a burl that survives fire, and then as soon as a fire passes through, the next iteration of that shrub comes out. So the plants are telling us that there's other ways to learn this, as the folks who spoke before me covered, but the plants are telling us that fire's been a part of this landscape for a long time. And so when a management decision to exclude fire will have significant impacts for our vegetation. So to give a couple of examples, that I think will, have some familiar elements to a lot of folks. Sudden oak death is a pathogen that was novel to this area about 30 years ago or so, has caused widespread mortality of tan oaks. That's a tree that in its mature form is basically lost from the forests of Marin now. And we know that places that have had regular fire have a much reduced impact of sudden oak death. And it's not because the fire gets rid of the pathogen. It doesn't. The pathogen comes back after the fire, but it has to do with the way that fire affects the pattern of vegetation across the landscape. What trees are there afterwards? Are those the ones that happen to be the major sporulating host? How dense are those trees? So what we're seeing is in ways that almost certainly we could not have predicted, by removing a landscape scale process, there's been major implications for our vegetation. And I'll give one more example. Douglas fir is a tree that's very common here in Marin and lots of other places too. And its strategy for fire is that the mature individuals have a thick bark. So if you've got a tree, let's say maybe 20 inches in diameter or larger, and you've got a moderate or low intensity fire, that tree is going to typically survive, but the small ones are killed off. And so with the exclusion of fire, we've got lots of places that before were something else. And now we've got Douglas fir becoming established in those places. It's not everywhere, but we see it in some places that used to be grassland that are now Doug fir. It used to be an oak woodland that you see the oaks are there, but the Doug fir is overtopping them. We see places on Mount Tam, you'll see some spots like on the Manzanita graveyards. You'll see the skeletons of where there were shrubs, and now there's a forest. So these are examples of where by excluding fire from this landscape, we see these changes, sort of a homogenization of our vegetation. So what I would say is the take home is that, biodiversity is not just like, let me count how many species are right here where I stand. It's about not just this spot, but how many different types of spots are there and how different are they from each other? And that's a really crucial part of the biodiversity that we protect in our public lands, in our natural areas. And that patchiness or heterogeneity is, fire was a key part of creating that, and fire can be a tool for maintaining that as well.
Thank you for sharing those examples, Sherry. Next question, Peter, can you tell us about what it takes to prepare an area for a safe and successful prescribed burn?
Yeah, sure. So I think, going back to my discussion about the impacts from colonialism and where we're starting today, really kind of, illustrates what we're dealing with in terms of having safe and successful burns. So we're not starting from a place where people have been burning for, thousands, hundreds or thousands of years. And, it's all set and ready to go. And, we just have different plots of land and areas where we can go out and do a nice cultural burn and it creeps along the ground. A lot of these places have really heavy fuels. And so, you're going to go out there and do some work before you ever put fire to the ground there, because if you did at the wrong time of year, then you would essentially have a wildfire. But you can achieve these really safe, successful prescribed burns, taking into account all of these factors and then preparing very well for that, creating fuel breaks and, fire lines, and taking care of some of those really dense fuels, and doing a lot of that work with hand tools or even mechanization or other sorts of things that, you can do beforehand. And, Sasha or someone else could also probably speak to these issues because I'm also learning about them. But, being able to take care of some of those things before you ever put fire to the ground so that you're controlling as many of those factors as possible. Prescribed burn isn't like completely controlled. That's why a lot of people don't call them controlled burns, because there's always a little bit of risk, but you're trying to reduce as much of that as possible. And you can have really, really safe and successful burns by looking at all those factors and why so much planning goes into these prescribed burns before they ever take place, as well as assessing the weather and all of the different conditions, even up to the night before and the day of the burn. And a lot of times, those things are canceled because it's just a no-go if one of those things isn't checked off the list. So a lot of preparation goes into making these things successful.
Sasha, do you have anything that you would like to add to that answer?
I think Peter did can people hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Check. Okay, cool. I think Peter did a great job answering it. I think a couple of things that I would maybe add is that we call it a prescribed burn, preferably because we are developing a prescription for that piece of ground, which means we're doing a pretty thorough assessment of what our objectives are in the first place. So whenever we do a prescribed burn, we have really clear objectives. That's always an important precursor. And then for that, like for us to meet those objectives, we're developing a specific prescription under which we would be burning, and basing that on how we want our fire behavior to be, and what prescription will allow us to meet those objectives. So that's a big part of it as well. And then just as Peter said, he answered it well, essentially going through and you have to kind of do a size up of how much prep is it going to take and what does that look like? It looks different on a lot of different landscapes. There's no one way to do the prep for any given burn. And we have partners in places who do first entry burns without doing any manual treatment or mechanized treatment beforehand. And it's just the first burn and then they go back in and they do repeat treatments. And usually after a few, you can get it back to a nice maintenance place. So there are lots of different ways and extents to which you can do understory prep so that you meet objectives and get back to your maintenance state in a quicker way, or you can do that over time with repeat burns.
Thank you for that explanation. Captain Reeser, can you tell us about how candidate areas are identified and prioritized? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I would say that determining the objectives first, right? There can be many reasons for trying to implement a prescribed fire. It can be fuels management, it can be native species control, it can be range habitat improvement. There can be a number of things that would kind of lead you toward the potential path of wanting to utilize fire as a tool here. And I think so determining the objectives and the outcomes is kind of the first real step with that, and that can vary obviously across different landscapes and fuel types and political climates and everything else. And the prioritization, it's really about the success for implementation and also looking at good acres versus just acres, as Mark Brown mentioned earlier. Acres aren't acres if they're treated, not all acres are equal, so to speak, depending on what the intent is and what the benefits are afterwards, right? It can be pretty easy to go burn off a large patch of pasture land, right? Technically speaking, there's not a lot of challenges, not a lot of risks to escape, and you might not really be achieving a fuel reduction goal, but you might be doing some range habitat improvement where, a small 2 to 3 acre unit, prescribed fire unit that's in a timber with heavy growth or in a heavily shrubbed area with coastal scrub or chaparral could be very challenging, and you might have a really low window for opportunity. So that might play into your prioritization. So, I think the prioritization piece really comes from the objective piece and what the priorities are from a land management or community goals perspective, as opposed to individual prescribed fires. So there's a lot of different pieces that go into planning prescribed burns, and the window of opportunity for completing them is a huge one. You could, plan for a great prescribed fire with really great outcomes predicted and have your prescriptions in place. But if you're in an area that has a really tight window because of coastal weather patterns, or maybe interior, it's too dry, and then it goes from too dry to unavailable because you get the rains, that has to play in your prioritization. What's realistic that you can actually think you can get done. So I think the critical piece is to have a wide range of projects that span a variety of areas that you then in essence have shelf ready, where depending on the weather conditions and the political climate and the smoke impacts and all the other things, that you can then go to those. And they're all in essence prioritized, as which one's going to be ready and available for us to do. Once you kind of assume that you want to try to accomplish them, then it's just kind of targets of opportunity and really windows of opportunity with weather and available resources and potential fire behavior conditions.
Chief Weber, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Jordan did a good job covering it. I mean, the bottom line is you've heard from Sherry and Peter and others that, we need to be doing more burning. That, I think what I'm collecting from this is that the state of our county is not a natural state. It's not what it looked like, before it was populated. And I think one of the things that hasn't been brought up is the challenge of burning from a safety perspective, because it's not as easy as putting fire on the ground anywhere in the county. And we have to take into account a risk versus gain, risk versus benefit. And then there's also windows of opportunity to meet the prescriptions that were challenged by, weather or resource availability in order to make sure it's a safe burn. So those are some of the factors. But, I think I was quoted in the newspaper saying I'd like to see 10,000 acres a year burned in this county. And that would mean we'd have about a 20-year regimen of fire back on the landscape. If we rotated that around the county, the number sounds massive, but I think that's the kind of, landscape level work we need to be doing to really achieve a more natural state.
Great. Now we can go on to discussing some of the challenges and concerns. So Sasha, how can we address the smoke concerns, and what does the permit process look like for prescribed burning?
Yeah, thanks. I would actually love to say one quick thing about the previous question from an alternative perspective. As an ecological prescribed fire implementer in this region, I would say that for us, we're prioritizing burning under redwoods, where there's way too much fuel accumulation, and the historic return interval for fire in redwoods in Marin County is every 4 years. And we've got super dense buildup of redwoods with really dense, thick buildup of fuels underneath them. And then oak woodlands and coastal prairie are huge prioritizations for us in Marin County. Coastal prairie is rapidly disappearing because of lack of disturbance. It's completely being taken over by coyote brush and Douglas fir. And our oak woodlands are similarly being encroached by Douglas fir and too much bay laurel, and are struggling from sudden oak death. So those are huge priorities for my program and our partners across the county. And we work hard to find those places that we can work and get some good prevention done in terms of loss of really valuable ecosystems and habitats that require fire to thrive. So in terms of smoke concerns and the permit process for that, when we're doing prescribed fires, and I think this is true for everyone who's implementing prescribed burning in Marin County, we're specifically looking for days where we have no inversion. We can get smoke to lift and be carried off away from people and population areas as much as possible. There are also really cool studies coming out right now showing a dramatic difference between prescribed fire smoke and wildfire smoke, and how it's actually really a valuable technique to use prescribed fire, get those small pulses of smoke released in ways and during times that we can have that lift and carry away, compared to wildfire smoke, which is inevitable at some point, where you're going to have really catastrophically toxic smoke lingering around and destroying air quality. The permit process for prescribed burning specifically for smoke is actually impressively like cooperative at this point. We've got a really positive relationship with Bay Area Air Quality Management District. They've made their process a lot easier and a lot more modern in recent days, and they're super supportive of prescribed fire. They really want to see us taking this preventative action, making a difference in the price of fuels, and improving the chances that when the wildfire comes, there won't be as done the prescribed fire incident reporting system now, which is the standard. It requires just submitting a smoke management plan 30 days prior to burning over prescribed fire incident reporting system. It's an easy online platform. You just make an account and then you request ignition authorization before burning. They approve it. You do your burn, and then you go in and report the total amount of vegetation burned. And again, the meteorologists are super supportive. They call me at like telling me that I should be burning because we're getting a good weather window, and asking me where I'm going to burn during this good weather window to make use of the opportunity. So it's awesome.
That's great to hear, Sasha. Next question, Peter, can you tell us about how we can balance greenhouse gas emissions from prescribed burning with sequestration resulting from new growth, improved soil, etc.?
Yeah, so how I've addressed this question in the past is just, with kind of going comparative with it, so if you think about wildfire and the emissions that puts off versus prescribed burning, and what kinds of emissions that has and how much carbon is sequestered in the old growth in our forests. If you maintain that old growth in the redwoods and all of these different forests that we have, you're significantly sequestering more carbon, and there are fewer emissions going out into the atmosphere. So you maintain that by doing some prescribed burning and, from that having some emissions, but it's not nearly what you would have if you had a wildfire. So the strategy is kind of, doing these really low intensity burns. And yes, you'll have some emissions every year, but it's not these catastrophic wildfires that produce all of these emissions all at once and does a lot of destruction to our forests. And it takes us so long to regrow that old growth. It's a true loss when some of that gets destroyed in these wildfires. So that's a strategy through prescribed burning where we fight fire with fire. And yes, there will be some emissions, but it's not nearly as bad as what happens if we do nothing and then we have these wildfires happening every year.
Cody, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so this is a newer science that is being looked at. We just went through a process at MidPen on doing our CEQA analysis, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. And one of the findings that we had to make was that we would be unable to mitigate our GHG emissions, mainly due to prescribed fire. And there was a discussion for quite a while about, well, can't we say that, hey, we are preventing more of GHG emissions because we are preventing more wildland fires. Currently right now, due to policy from Sacramento, no, we can't make that statement. But we were able to make that statement in what we call the overriding considerations. And to be able to say, hey, look, yes, we are going to have an impact to the environment from doing a prescribed fire. But under all the considerations and the science that we have as of right now, it does look like prescribed fire does have a lower GHG emissions than a wildland fire going through the same area. So these are one of the things that we have to sort of think about when we're doing planning for any of these prescribed fires, is that there are other considerations that we need to take into account and that GHG emissions is not the whole picture. And so, making sure that you're looking at what you're doing and keeping up with the latest science. And one of the big aspects of our program that we wanted to make sure that we got out there was we wanted to make sure that we were monitoring what we were doing at a scientific level, to where not only are we doing these burns and we're monitoring if we're making sure that we're meeting our objectives, but are they going back to the science? Can we contribute back to the science to have it better inform future projects? So we do have a quite extensive monitoring program, especially around GHG emissions when we go ahead and do these burns. So that way we can contribute back and make sure that we're staying up with the latest science.
Thank you, Cody. Next slide. Oop. Oh, no. Oh, okay, sorry. Chief Weber, can you tell us how we can mitigate the possibility of an escape and help our community become more comfortable with prescribed burning?
This is Jordan. I think we might have lost Chief Weber there momentarily. Oh, he's back.
Off and came back on. Can you guys hear me okay? I guess my internet connection isn't great.
Yep, we can hear you now.
All right, I'm going to leave my camera off. But, the possibility of this escape always exists. And those prescriptions include the weather, both predicted and current, that we use to make a decision. We use, the fuel modification. So as I think Peter mentioned, we may use mechanical removal of some fuels prior to actually burning to reduce the intensity. But we also burn under a certain prescription. And if the winds pick up to a point where we're not comfortable or it's out of the prescription, we stop burning. We have sufficient resources at scene, both for holding and keeping the fire contained, but also to mop up afterwards so embers don't escape the control lines.
Captain Racer, do you have anything to add?
I think no, just generally speaking, that it is it's inherently risky operation. It's easy to say, we're going to do prescribed fire, but there are some real, and there's a historical. If you look up escape fires on Google, you'll find numerous escape fires across the country that have, been pretty catastrophic to communities. So we don't take it lightly. That's the reason I say that we are on the very, very cautious side of when a prescription is planned for and whether or not we're going to meet that. And a lot of times it has to do with resource availability as well, not just weather prescriptions. And the challenge then, the smoke piece with the air quality is fairly straightforward on the simple burns these days. But they're still not super comfortable in fires, prescribed burns that are lasting multiple days, right? They would like the fire to be out by the evening time. So when you want to burn in the timber, you're going to have potentially fires that burn for days, if not weeks. And I think there was a case in Muir Woods when the Park Service burned over 20 years ago. They had a fire, they did a prescribed fire in August, and they were still getting smoke complaints, kind of deep rooted in the forest of Muir Woods late into October, right? So months of smoke production. So that's a reality that is real, and it really then is the biggest for comfortable with prescribed fire. A lot of it is the social political climate, right? It's when a chief or ECC or a board of supervisors or mayors getting numerous complaints or concerns from individuals about smoke, or they're seeing fire on the hill or whatever it is, kind of what their threshold for tolerance is. That's a huge piece, that it really, the comfort level is to the political and the larger social piece, not so much to the fire organizations, I don't think, because we have very specific processes and comfort levels. We're not going to engage if we don't feel. So it's really getting the public and our politicians and the rest of kind of the non-fire world to see the importance and also live with a little bit of fear at times, because it's going to be there when they're sitting there.
Thank you, Captain Reeser. Sherry, can you tell us about how we can avoid the spread of invasive species and hopefully use prescribed burns as a way to manage future invasive species populations?
Yeah, so a prescribed burn may be able to achieve invasive management goals, but a burn will have multiple goals, and sometimes those goals can't be simultaneously achieved. And then in addition, as you know, Jordan and Jason already have spoken to, there's operational limitations. So I'll give you a couple of examples of why oftentimes fire needs to be used in concert with other tools that we use to achieve our invasive plant management goals. I think probably the single most common species in the literature in terms of using fire to control it in California is Medusa head, which is an annual grass that can be very invasive in grasslands. There's literature going back to the 50s of people successfully using prescribed fire to control it. And you have to get the timing just right. So this is a grass that matures a tiny bit later than the rest of the grasses. So by the time that the seeds are still hanging onto the seed head, the rest of your grasses are have died for the year. So you've got some fuel to carry that fire, but you need to time it so that the seed hasn't shattered yet, because it's not going to kill the seeds if they're on the ground. They need to be up where it's a little hotter, a little higher above the ground. So and then you get an order of magnitude drop. It's very successful in that first entry typically. And if you miss that window of opportunity, you're not going to get that drop. So as you've already, I think, heard, you can't always say, I can only burn this week. That's all I got, right? So there can be some challenges off the operational limitations, but there can be some times when fire is a very effective tool. I'll give you another example. French broom is a plant that I'm guessing most of the folks who are joining us today is familiar with. It's very common in Marin County. We know that fire stimulates the seed bank. So after fire, you will see a flush of broom. They think that the seeds are actually scarified by fire. It's triggered by fire. And it takes that plant 2 to 3 years to be reproductively mature. So, you know, as if with any management action, your question should always be, what are you going to do next? What's your follow-up? And also not just what are you trying to get rid of, but what are you managing for? So for us and probably a lot of the other agencies looking at this tool, a lot of the places that we have broom, we're managing for hardwoods. We've got madrones, we've got oaks. And if we were to say we're only going to use fire and broom is our primary goal, we might be going in there every year, every other year, but that's a much higher frequency than was the historic fire return interval for those hardwoods that we're managing for. And it would start to really kind of hammer those trees if we were really coming in there every year to manage that broom as it's coming back. So we'd be looking more at a strategy of following up a fire with probably manual or mechanical means to manage the broom after the fire. So an awareness that it's coming and identifying that you're going to need those resources to do that follow-up treatment of the other methods. So the take home is that, one, you need to know what you have. You should know what invasive species are in that. I mean, anytime you're managing land, right, you're going to do a better job if you know it. So know it's there, know it's fire ecology. And Sasha did a great job talking about this. Be clear on what your management goals are, and you may need to prioritize. You may not be able to manage everything that, for everything that you're hoping for using just fire. Acknowledge operational limitations, whether it's, you know, smoke or weather, and Chief Weber talked about this. Just acknowledge that, you know, if I say I've got 10 days to do this burn, I may or may not get that burn done. The take home is that often to be effective with invasive species management, we're going to use multiple tools. Fire is one, but we're probably going to need to partner with other tools in order to meet our goals.
If I could just chime in really quick, and that is there are many best management practices that have been developed, especially by California Invasive Plant Council. You know, you can go to their website and they have some great resources on how can we avoid the spread of invasive species, especially in a fire environment.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry and Cody. Next question. Ooh, skipped it. Captain Reeser, is there currently any research occurring in Marin regarding prescribed fire and fuel reduction?
Not necessarily research. I mean, I think, fuels management and the utilization of prescribed fire for fuels management has been pretty heavily studied throughout the West and across the country, in different, because most of the forested types or all types of vegetation in this country actually do have a fire return interval, right? Even if you might not think of it as, the swamps of Florida and the timberlands in New Jersey and the grasslands in Nebraska. So there's been a lot of research and study out there. And I think we're just going to really rely on the general practices and techniques and kind of understanding from that we're using this as a tool, right? That and if it's for fuel reduction, the same thought process we would have if we were going to go and maybe mechanically remove fuel with chainsaws and crews, or with masticator mulching heads, or grazing, perhaps. That this prescribed fire is just another tool in our toolbox. And we know that it can be very successful in reducing fuel loads in certain forested and grassland and shrub types, but it can also maybe not be the right tool. So based on all the other things we've been talking about today. So the Park Service in Point Reyes and Golden Gate historically has had a long history in the last 25 years of burning. And there's pretty good data. They have really good data, actually, for post-fire fuel loading levels, et cetera, et cetera. And they're pretty consistent with, if it's in the coastal scrub, the same information that's been gathered at, Channel Islands or Santa Barbara or up the coast. So the information is really out there. I think we have enough base information that we don't need to dive into trying to kind of rethink the wheel on determining success or not once we set our goals and objectives, which could be, reducing, dead and down material by a certain percentage, or reducing tons per acre, or whatever the objective would be. So I think we're just going to really take advantage when we start to implement prescribed fires, using all the other work and all the other studies and all the prescribed fire specialists and fire ecologists across the country in the West that have put a lot of time and research into this, and really kind of use them as the foundation moving forward, with us really then just being practitioners and making smart decisions with where and how we use fire.
Thanks, Jordan. Sasha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we do actually have monitoring plots for research at Martin Griffin Preserve off the Bolinas Lagoon in Marin, where we've been doing understory thinning of Douglas fir to try to restore what was actually coastal prairie along what used to be a fire road that got so heavily vegetated and so heavily fuel loaded that it had to be retired, which is the Bourne Road. And in one of our burn units there, we have monitoring plots in there that are counting tons per acre of fuel on site on the surface. And when we started our work in there, it was so dense you couldn't even see like 5 feet in front of you, because the dead Douglas fir trees and sticks were all just so crazy thick. We called it the Blair Witch Project. We did understory thinning in there. Before our thinning, it was 24.5 tons per acre. After our thinning, it went up to 36 tons per acre. And after we did a prescribed burn in there to reduce the fuel load, it went down to 3 tons per acre. So massive reduction in the fuel loading along that fire road that we're trying to now reopen. We're hoping to continue that monitoring that we're doing is paired with herbaceous sampling to get a better understanding of the understory response and the return of native bunch grasses, as well as overstory monitoring, looking at the structure of the canopy in there. And we're hoping that over time we'll be able to communicate this in papers for managers to have a better understanding of that. We're also doing a lot of research right now on fuel moistures across the region and what different fuel moistures different species are flammable at, so that we have a better understanding of our sweet spot for what fuel moistures we want to do prescribed fires in different fuel models or different ecosystems and habitat types, versus also like what is too wet to burn and what is too dry to meet our objectives. And then the other piece that we're researching currently is the fuel models that exist that are commonly utilized in the US do not at all match the fuels that we have here in the Bay Area. They're based on typical lands of Forest Service properties across the US. and do not come from our fuel models here or our fuel types here. So currently we're also working on building out custom fuel models that match the actual species compositions and ecosystems that we have present in this area, so that those can be utilized for fire behavior modeling in a program called Behave Plus, and then used further from that to help us get better information about what fire behavior we might expect on our prescribed burns, how changes in the fuel loading might impact fire behavior. And also that would also be useful data for people in suppression who are also similarly doing fuel modeling or fire behavior modeling to get a better understanding and prediction of what the next day's fire behavior might be. So those are some of the research efforts we're pursuing currently regarding prescribed fire and fuel reduction in Marin County.
That sounds great, Sasha. Thank you. Sherry, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge, I think Jordan brings up an important point. Definitely not every implementation project can be a research project, and there's a lot we can learn from what folks have done in other locations. I can share just briefly some of the work that's been done on Marin Waterland. We partnered with Cal Poly and UC Davis a few years ago to understand, and this is not around prescribed fire, this is fuel reduction work, our forestry resiliency work, to understand the impacts of that work. And so the sort of take home from their work is that, one, our methods were successful at reducing the density of trees without negatively impacting the carbon storage. Basically, the carbon's in your big trees and we're leaving the big trees. So that's what was the outcome. We've learned that tan oak regeneration is extremely vigorous here in Marin. They had some plots up in Humboldt, and it was a very different situation up there. But for us, don't think you're going to do this work and then walk away. 5 years later, you're going to have a lot of basically a shrub layer. So tan oak is, as a mature tree, is killed by sudden oak death mostly around here, but it's very vigorous in that sort of shrubby stage. And so think about, again, what are you going to do next? And then the hydrologists found in concert, and similar to what other researchers have found, that when you reduce density, you increase water availability to the trees that remain. So, there's less straws in the milkshake, right? So the way other researchers have phrased this is it increases resiliency to drought, but essentially there's more water left for the trees that are there. There's other things we're interested in as well, but I don't have results to share with you. These are things that we've just started up more recently, looking at the impacts of our fuels and forestry work on the understory. We're interested in what's going on at the herbaceous level, and also what the forest future is like. So what's in the seedling and the sapling stage? What do we see coming in? But that's you'll have to ask me in a few years before I've got data to share on that.
Thank you for sharing, Sherry. So next, we're going to talk about some of the case studies and examples that are happening in and around Marin County. So we'll start with Cody. Can you tell us about how Mid-Penn Open Space has incorporated prescribed burning into your work plans, and what obstacles you faced during the process?
Sure, thank you. So Mid-Penn had been burning for quite a while, and in 2009, that program sort of came to an end. Up until that point, we had been working with CAL FIRE hand in hand, using their environmental impact report that they had put out. And at the time, there started to be talk about lawsuits in regards to their EIR and the adequacy of the EIR. And so Mid-Penn management talked with CAL FIRE, and it was determined, instead of putting the entire program at jeopardy, that we would actually stop doing burns on Mid-Penn lands. So we immediately stopped doing burns in 2009 with the full intent to re-up the prescribed fire program, going through our own CEQA process. So we started working on that in 2014 by starting off with an integrated pest management program that included a portion of fire in there, not prescribed fire, but doing fire work, fuels management work. And that got completed in 2014, 2015, and then 2017, I picked up the mantle as the project manager for the prescribed fire program, which turned into a pretty massive program called the Wildland Fire Resiliency Program. And we hit one of our major milestones in May of this year, and that was the certification of a program level EIR for all the different work that we do, including vegetation management using mechanical means. We delayed the prescribed fire portion because we wanted to make sure that we could get a handle on the vegetation management as fast as possible. And we thought that it would be less controversial and sort of easier to get passed through. Part of the challenges of MidPen is the fact that we have 12 different fire agencies that share our jurisdiction. So that is 12 different voices telling MidPen what additional work needs to be done, and no coordinated effort really between these 12 agencies. And so to sort of hone that in and sort of get everybody on the same page, we went through that process of the fire program. Now, phase 2 was the prescribed fire portion, which is what we're starting right now. And we're starting with a lot of stakeholder meetings. So this is the reaching out to elected officials, to tribal members, to advocacy groups, CDFW, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and also our fire agencies as well. So right now, like I said, we're in the planning phases of doing prescribed fire, and we are hoping to have that entire process finished by May of 2023. So with luck, we'll be restarting our fire program that was put on hold in 2009 to get this one more tool into our tool belt. MidPen, we really are hoping, the vast majority or the biggest objective of our prescribed fire program is really about the natural resource benefits, is number one. Number two is the cultural resources. And sort of farther down on that is the fuels management portion. And so we're really taking a very heavy look at the biological effects that fire will have on these areas and making sure that we are going through this process correctly. Keep in mind, just like Marin, the WUI, the wildland urban interface, is quite big in Silicon Valley. We have many different houses throughout the area of all different sizes and shapes. And so honing in on where we're going to be doing prescribed fire and the objectives of the prescribed fire, and going through the environmental analysis to make sure that we're doing right by the land does take time and effort.
Thank you, Cody. So next we'll move sort of into Marin and hear from some of our panelists that have already completed successful burn projects, and as well as hear about some of their upcoming plans. So Captain Reeser, can you sort of start us off?
Yeah, most definitely. I think, Marin County Fire Department does not have any land management responsibilities, so to speak, just fire suppression and prevention responsibilities across many lands of the county. So we are really here to help facilitate and cooperate and coordinate with local land management agencies, private property, to help implement projects, because we are a lot of times the deciding factor of whether or not, from as we represent CAL FIRE, we are the approver of those projects to make sure things are in place. So, as I mentioned, the water district had now Marin Water had a success of a prescribed fire program for a number of years, and it's been quite some time. I was actually on the last prescribed fire they did in Lagunitas Meadows, and that was probably 15 or 16 or 17 years ago. The National Park Service has had a pretty active fire program in the Bay Area, Point Reyes in particular, and down in Golden Gate and some other areas. And I was pretty actively involved with that. One of my previous position titles was prescribed fire specialist with the National Park Service. So that was under my purview. And I think, we're really looking at trying to find the best way to successfully to start to bring it back, and bring it back in a meaningful way, and not just we don't need to bring it back in a test case kind of way, like, what's the fire going to do in the coastal chaparral or the coastal scrub or the understory Doug fir. I think the real what we need to do there is see what the reaction from the public and the elected is, and not so much from a fire operations or even an ecological perspective, because those are fairly well known as a whole. So There has been a history of projects, and we've assisted with Sasha and some of her team out there on the coast. They've done a few little projects, and then we've had some interest from quite a few private property landowners. You know, the ranching community in West Marin had a very active prescribed program for a number of years, and a lot of times it was to reduce star thistle and other things like that, or to improve range habitat. So there is quite a bit of interest from the ranching community to figure out the best way they can utilize as more of a land management tool, but that still has impacts and threats for escape. Just because you're burning to improve rangeland doesn't mean there's not a potential for that fire to escape. So, you know, Marin does have a history of burning, and a lot of the open space and other areas had burned, and it's really been put on hold for the last, I'll just say 20 years outside of the National Park Service land. And it's going to be a challenge to bring it back, but I think with support from all, you know, the midpin comment there about, you know, multiple agencies, kind of fire agencies, and very similar to Marin, right? We have jurisdictions, fire jurisdictions that abut our open space and our water district lands and other places, and they're all going to have a say in some of this. So this kind of collaborative effort is going to be critical, but we're going to have a little bit of tolerance for risk and for smoke. And so I think as we move into the future, the Park Service we had plans this year to do maybe, I think it was 380 something acres along Highway 1 in the Lima Valley, for fuel reduction and broom control and some Doug fir containment. But that was put on hold because of the early season heavy rains that kind of took us out of the window of opportunity. And then we were also going to assist and do some work up with Sherry up on the Marin Water, do some kind of pilot projects up there on the ridgetop in the Doug fir understory. And the weather really just put the clamp on that when we got that soaking rain that kind of prohibited us from doing it. So we're looking at next year, kind of the same projects that we had on the plan this year, I think, in the county. We did do one burn. The Hill Ranch burn was a training burn, but also had some prescribed fire and fuel management benefits in the Novato jurisdiction. We'll continue to do that next year, expand on that within the project perimeter. And then pile burning will be more integrated into our fuels management. The water district, Marin Water, does quite a bit of pile burning, and we'll start to see more of that, I think, as we get farther away from the kind of buffer around homes, and we do get out into the wildlands and along fire roads in more remote places where chipping and other mechanized tools aren't a possibility. So I think the communities in Marin are going to start to see more smoke in the air, and it will be very interesting to see the reaction moving forward, for sure. We didn't have any issues with the Novato, the ranch fire. We had a few people concerned, and then once they knew what was occurring, they were actually pretty comfortable with it. And part of that was good outreach and public information to the community. So
Thanks for sharing, Captain Reeser. Sherry, can you tell us about some of your successful burns or potentially your upcoming projects?
Yeah, sure. As Jordan mentioned, we do have a history. It's been a while since we've done broadcast burns, but we've continued pile burning in recent years through time. So as you got the sense from Cody, when for public agencies, we've got a process we need to go through. So for us in 2019, we completed work on our vegetation management plan, the biodiversity, fuels, and fire implementation plan. And that plan includes the use of broadcast burning for forest and grassland and oak woodlands. And so our programmatic EIR for that plan identifies the steps that we need to take to ensure we're meeting our obligations under the California Environmental Quality Act. And so for about the past year, we've been working to implement that. So just sort of briefly, we started as staff by identifying potential locations. We pulled in a consultant who's a prescribed fire specialist who's recently retired from the National Park Service to help us assess those units. Some of them were better choices than others, modify them as needed, and write the burn plans. So that's been completed. Working with our partner, County Fire, Jordan's been out, he mentioned that, with us walking around the units. Chief Weber's been really supportive. We've got an agreement with them because they would be our lead implementers. and reaching out to neighbors. In the case of the unit Jordan was talking about, that's state parks. And actually the way the boundary goes, their boundary is about 30 feet before the road that we would use as our natural control line. So potentially it even has a little sliver of state parks land. So we already have a great relationship with them, and they're really supportive and interested. They have their own process they need to go through, but that communication, the compliance, so going through the steps that we need to go through, we're not totally done with that, but we are getting close. Preparing for the outreach and communication, pulling in our communication staff. You might have heard there's a drought, so our communication staff has a few other things they do also, but they're on board and have that expertise. And then preparing for public safety. So we all know that Mount Tam is a very well visited and loved place. We want our visitors to understand what's going on and be safe. So that takes some preparation. So basically, we think we're at the point where in a few months, we'll have all the pieces in place so that when that opportunity comes along, we'll be ready to put fire on the ground. And because it is a really long process, we're actually kind of starting with the next round at the same time. We've just within the last couple of weeks been identifying kind of what's our next batch of units. And it's really similar to something Sasha talked about earlier of like, we're really targeting our oak woodlands in terms of places that we think would be the best place to target, and where is that topographically and access wise in a place that might operationally be possible to do fire. So we've got that whole next batch of potential units that will take through those same steps that I've just talked about. So we are trying to put fire in the ground, and we hope to do that soon.
Thanks for sharing your experience, Sherry. Sasha, would you mind sharing some of your experience as well as maybe any upcoming plans?
Sure. So we've got a couple of really exciting projects in Marin County. One is at Martin Griffin Preserve, which I spoke about a little bit earlier. It's at Martin Griffin Preserve on the Bolinas Lagoon, just off of Highway 1, that Bourne Ridge project. So we're trying to restore coastal prairie and reopen up that fire road all the way from top to bottom between Highway 1 and the ridge top there. So that's a really exciting project. It's got multiple benefits, trying to do ecological restoration of a rapidly disappearing and degrading habitat type that fosters incredible biodiversity, and trying to reopen that fire road so that it could be an anchor in the event or when the wildfire comes, so that we could actually use it as a part of fire response. We for that are doing regular and frequent burns there throughout the wet season, and in the future probably also in some of the less wet seasons. I would love to just let people know, like, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, if you see smoke coming from Bourne Ridge, it's probably us doing a prescribed burn. Keep an eye out for those road signs that say prescribed burn ahead, do not report, because we're putting up a lot of smoke at different times of year out there. It's a continuing process, and it's going to take years to get through all of the exciting work out there. And we're going to be doing a lot of small entries over time throughout every year. Another project we've got going on is along the Highway 101 corridor, just within Marin County, south of Petaluma, a little bit north of what you would think of as Novato. And that's going to be about 110 acres total of prescribed burning under oak woodlands there. So similarly, if you see smoke along Highway 101 when you're commuting north or south, it very well may be our prescribed burn there underneath those oaks, trying to do some restoration in there as well. And then I think Peter might have a project he might want to share about, not to put you on the spot, Peter.
Yeah, so I'm in the Fire Forward Fellows Program this year and developing my skills in prescribed burning. And as a part of that, I'm really excited to be thinking about a project with Audubon Canyon Ranch at Tom's Point. And this is really significant for me personally and familially and culturally, because this is out at Tomales Bay, where many of our families lived in the early 1900s and late 1800s, and also, on back before colonization. But, through our history, a lot of those families got rooted through the mission system and a bunch of Mexican ranches. People moved around from Olompali out to Echetamal, kind of, these different properties where people were finding, native communities to essentially hide out from settlers and have a safe haven. And a lot of people got pushed to the outskirts of our tribal territory in West Marin at Tamales Bay. And that's where a lot of the families, whether they were from there or from other places in the territory before contact, a lot of people got pushed to the coast. So a lot of families have connections there. My uncle talked a lot about all of the different plants and animals that he was hunting and gathering, because a lot of people supplemented their income with a lot of those traditional practices, gathering teas as medicines, going hunting for waterfowl and, mud hens and all of those kinds of things. So anyway, and then, of course, the clam and oyster industry as well. But Tom's Point is a really significant place. It's where Coast Miwok people were living. Tom Wood was a settler who established a ranch there, as well as a business for shipping and a bunch of different products that were coming in and out of the bay. And so the opportunity to be able to go back to this really significant place and this really significant area that has a lot of cultural and family meaning for a lot of people in the tribe. It's a real pleasure to think about burning there and, how that can play into restoration of that area, as well as just more tribal involvement and engagement with that coastline and that bay. So it's really exciting for me. And hopefully we're going to get this up and running for next fall. So really exciting.
Thanks for sharing, Peter, and to everyone for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with us today. So that was our last formal question. It's now time for the Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to transfer all of the attendees over to panelists so that we can have a more open discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then Mark, if you want to start at the top of the list, I'll start at the bottom of the list.
Sounds good, Maria.
Sorry, it's a long list. Okay, so I think everyone has had the opportunity to upgrade themselves. If they haven't chosen to, that's okay too. So to go about the question and answer session, if everyone just wants to use the raise hand function to make things a little easier, and then I can kind of call on you by order. Sashi, you have a question?
So I'm actually here with kind of a couple of hats on. One as an MWPA board member with my fellow board member Julie McMillan, who has her hand raised as well, and then secondly with my new job as wildfire vegetation mitigation program manager through UC Cooperative for the County of Sonoma. So wanted to just ask you. I put this in the Q&A earlier. There are some who said that it's really more natural to have some more of a no management policy for the land, and wondering what you all might have to say about does a no management philosophy make for a healthier landscape, and why can't we just let fires happen and let them sort of burn? I think you've addressed some of that in the talk, but wondering if you can address that philosophy directly and what you all think, whether a no management type philosophy contributes to the health of the landscape.
Yeah, so I can start addressing that a little bit. So I think if you consider no management whatsoever, and you're willing to have, these massive wildfires, you're going to see tremendous impact to people's livelihood and property, and and everything. And so to go back to, essentially no people here and wipe the slate clean, you're essentially saying that, you're going to create this place that's really uninhabitable for people, because it wasn't like that for thousands of years of Native people living in these areas in Marin County, Coast Miwok people. And so, just back then, a lot of people think of it as, this open natural landscape, but it was very intensively stewarded by Native people throughout those thousands of years. And it was for similar reasons to today, where people wanted to protect their communities, protect their village areas and the places that they lived, as well as the resources and their staple foods that they didn't want to burn down. So to maintain those kinds of oak woodlands and other different places and have productive, reliable food sources, to have the really dense populations that we did in California before contact, as dense as anywhere in the US, and probably more dense than many areas north of Mexico. So people were very actively and intensively stewarding the land for those different results to maintain populations like that. So in order to have those habitable landscapes, cultural landscapes that have existed here for a very, very long time, which is what people think of when you think of the natural environment, is, this vision of what existed just before contact. And that, is an anthropogenic or cultural landscape. So, the sort of natural landscape, that sort of imaginary, is really kind of a myth, unless you go back to like the Ice Age and, woolly mammoths and, saber-toothed tigers and sorts of things roaming around, which, is a completely different type of landscape. I don't think we have that, and I don't think we should go back to that. And I think it doesn't make sense in terms of wanting to live here with everything that's around us and maintain safe spaces for us too.
And if I could just chime in really quickly, I've heard that argument before, the unmanaged, keeping your hands off the land. That has an assumption in it, and that is that this is a closed system, and that the ecosystem in this location, there's nothing coming in, nothing coming out, and that it's going to find its own sort of resting point. Well, guess what? Climate change is real. It is affecting the environment. It is reacting to the environment. So the ecology sort of builds on itself. And it is our responsibility as the human cause of climate change to protect these species that aren't nearly as resilient due to our inputs into this. And so I really firmly believe that it takes a management approach. We got ourselves into the situation. It's going to take us to get us out of the situation as well.
Yeah, and if I could follow up on that too, along similar lines, there's this concept of reciprocity and balance, and it's not necessarily like everyone's living in harmony and it's so easy to, live along with nature. Things, you have to make decisions where, there's a give and a take. And that's what maintains that balance is, having a dynamic system where, you are going to take some things out, like, in the case of hunting, if you don't have any hunting pressure, then, you have these herds of animals that really grow to their capacity and past it until you have greater rates of sickness and, animals dying from, starvation or, thirst, with in times of drought or things like that. And so, you have different kinds of stewardship practices where you're not only just giving back and giving and giving and giving and not taking anything out of that system. You have to do a little bit of both. And we're seeing that with, these wilderness areas where, we've left them and, there may be like restoration projects to set something up. But then if you don't take anything out of that system as well and maintain that and have an active relationship along the way, it can set that out of balance again. So there has to be that relationship continuing.
Julie, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, and all the panelists. This was really interesting and stimulating. My question is, what steps can electeds take and firefighters, agencies take to better educate the public about prescribed fire and get people more comfortable with this?
Mhm.
I can shoot for that if you want. I think, thank you, Julie, for the question. I think that the biggest thing is there can't be resistance to it, and resistance comes, from a level of probably feeling uncomfortable. And so we need to start small and work our way towards larger projects. The control burn that Jordan mentioned up in Novato, and I apologize, you can hear the chainsaws running underneath me. Our fire crew is doing some work, but there was quite a bit of complaints. It's also important for us to do these under prescriptions where the smoke has better dispersal. So it's a combination of things, but I think it's working with our elected officials, helping them understand, because they're ultimately the ones that field many of the complaints. So they can, better respond to their constituents. And then I think for the fire department, it's communication. It may be in the form of door to door, which is very time consuming and takes a lot of people, but can be very effective because people can ask questions. Social media, there's lots of ways to reach folks, but ultimately I think just we as a community, both from a fire service, from elected officials, and ultimately the greater community, just have to get used to the inconvenience. And in some cases, it is a health impact for residents, but how they can, and how we can help, manage the smoke, but they can manage, being in a closed environment or away for the day, if there's burning going on, those kind of things. It's going to take a combination of a lot of different stuff. And, our burning program stopped in the late 80s. Predominantly because of environmental concerns and smoke complaints. And I think that, hearing people today explain from an environmental perspective the benefits, I think there isn't the resistance there used to be there, but there still is smoke resistance, and the air quality district has gotten much better about understanding the importance of prescribed fire and working with us to make sure that the days we're doing it, it's the least impactful to the Bay Area.
And if I may add on a little bit to this, Marin County, a lot of people view Marin County as one big entity rather than independent local agencies. And there's truth and there's myth to that conception. And because as small as Marin County is, Mill Valley is much different than Novato. However, I think when it comes to prescribed fire and the messaging and the support behind prescribed fire, a consistent message from our elected officials, I think, is very important, and that consistent support. And I really think that's where the MWPA comes in line, and having elected officials from each of our member agencies being part of our board and helping to deliver that consistent message. And then there's the regulatory issues that sometimes we run into, and has been outlined. Bay Area Air Quality Management District has really changed their stance when it comes to prescribed fire. They are much more cooperative and been more working with us, and I think in part by pressure from our local officials. So as we bump up against any other regulatory challenges, I think that's where our local officials and elected officials can help provide that voice for us.
One other thing I would like to mention is to keep in mind also that the concerns that are being raised by the citizens, they're real concerns. And so we can't ignore them. We can't just brush them off and say, oh, that's not a concern. It is a concern, and they're bringing it up. And so we have to be truthful with them, be transparent with them, and tell them, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. I find a lot of times you can get into a situation where my science is better than your science, and we sort of have to get away from that, I think, and really just have conversations with people and come to a mutual understanding.
I think one thing I would add is think about how we bring about a cultural change, because that's really what your question is, right? Like, how do we change our culture? And so the answer is all the above. So I like what Cody was bringing up about, we as public officials and as land managers, making sure we're doing what we can to communicate and to provide information. But all of you who took 2 hours out of your day to do this, and who take your time to be a part of ESP and all the other groups you're a part of, are a part of that. Talk to your neighbors, write letters to the editor in your local paper. Talk to the other groups you're a part of. The folks in ESP are already listening and interested. Are you a part of a garden club or a group that isn't familiar with these ideas? How can you be a part of this cultural shift? We have responsibilities, and Mark and Jason have talked to the role that fire folks and MWPA can play, but everyone else too. So thanks for being a part of that, and I welcome you continuing to help us to bring about this cultural shift.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tara, or not Tara, Sherry. Tara, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Wonderful. I feel like this might have been answered slightly with the last question, but I work a lot with landowners in Marin County and run across problems of, not problems, but some understandable hesitation with prescribed burns, specifically with landowners that have implemented restoration planting practices on their property over the past 20, 30 years and are very concerned about just kind of watching their money, for lack of a better word, go up into smoke. So I was wondering if the MWPA or other people on this panel have some suggestions on how they've managed to find that balance between restoration planting practices and spending money on that while supporting prescribed burning at the same time.
I could take a stab at the beginning part or part of it, and then if any of our other panelists want to chime in, I welcome that. Restoration is interesting and important, and there's no one size fits all for the restoration. Sometimes the restoration planting may follow prescribed fire or may follow other vegetation management practices. And then there's other times that the restoration practices can start first, and then the prescribed fires could actually help with that restoration, since what we're trying to get back to that state where our ecology was fire adapted, and we've kind of made it not fire adapted. So you can make a strong argument that the restoration planning goes hand in hand with prescribed fire.
The one thing I want to chime in about this one is, restoration, that word, a lot of people take it as, hey, we put in plants, we build it, and then they will come, meaning the wildlife will just come in and we have a happy habitat. I've seen this at multiple conferences lately, and I fully believe in it, is that restoration is more about the natural processes and not necessarily the plants that are there. They're just like one of the aspects of restoration. And so we're trying to get a the processes started back up, and the natural processes that we've seen, and prescribed fire is one of those. And like was just said, a lot of times it can enhance the area when we do a prescribed fire. Maybe not, if we did a planting this November and then we burn it in May, that's not going to be the greatest. But once these plants that have been fire adapted are established, the fire is actually going to be helping out those plantings and the habitat and the entire restoration process.
And this is Jordan. I can maybe just on the last piece, I think it was maybe about cost effectiveness and whatnot. I think generally speaking, depending on the goals and the outcomes that are desired, prescribed fire over, there's kind of a scale of return on it, but usually you can treat a larger area utilizing prescribed fire. It's more cost effective than it is if you're going to try to treat the same area with mechanized people. You think about fire moving across the landscape in whatever speed it's moving and doing its work at reducing fuels versus individuals with chainsaws or equipment and manually kind of covering the same ground. So from an economic perspective, I think a lot of times it's money very well spent, especially cost effective when you're talking about long-term maintenance of sites, right? Where you're having, when the fire intensity becomes reduced because you've already had a treatment in there, and then, the potential fire behavior, and then the need for this number of fire engines and equipment stuff would go down. So it can be a very cost-effective way compared to the other means if you're going to do treatments, right? And obviously doing nothing in the short term is much cheaper than doing that, but that's not a good option.
Belle, you want to ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep, we can.
Okay. A couple things. One is, I'm going back to the question that was raised earlier, because it seems important if you want to make a positive case, both among agencies and to the public, let alone the legislature, is, the comparison between, there are a lot of factors, but the comparison of prescribed burning versus what Jordan was just talking about, all the different mechanizations that there are to deal with fuels. I just think that looking at that, wouldn't it be useful? And I don't know who would do it. I mean, it's something that could be done at a university level, but it also could be done at a site, which is just to see from certain criteria which ones are better from a cost perspective, from an emissions perspective, from a smoke perspective, so that you have a better case to make in using prescribed burns versus the other methods. That's a subject I wondered if anyone would like to handle.
I would encourage you to think of it as not an either or and as location specific. The data on dollars per acre to do a mechanical treatment or a prescribed fire, it's out there, and it varies by orders of magnitude because, as we always say in ecology, it depends. The truth is we need all of those tools. There are a few places where maybe you could use any of them, but there's lots of places where one of them is going to be better than the other. So I think you're right to ask us to do a good job communicating. Prescribed fire is a great tool in situation X, Y, Z, and mechanical treatments overlap for some of those situations and is a better tool for these other situations, et cetera. So I wouldn't so much think of it as an either or as there's going to be some kind of a ledger that's going to tell you, the answer is always fire and never mechanical. Get to know these tools and remember that sites are complex, and sometimes more than one tool will work. Sometimes, remember, there's also just so many logistical realities So let's say I've got a site that I really think fire would be the best for because of the ecology of the plants that are there and what I know about. Maybe I've got a rare plant that's a bulb plant, and I know that would really benefit from fire, but maybe my window of opportunity keeps on passing and I just haven't been able to get in there with fire, or logistically, I just can't get any engines there and there's just no way I could pull it off. I'm going to use these other tools. So when you want an answer to that question, start with a specific site, and then you're going to be able to get a lot closer to an answer.
Okay.
I find also that when we do these cost benefit analysis, a lot of benefits are sort of left off the table. People just don't think about the benefit of a production of, say, red maids, where we get a huge production of red maids, which is a nice little Ford flower that produces a bunch of food for certain species. And it's hard to put a dollar amount in a way to that benefit. So we get a lot of benefits that are unseen and are kind of hard to explain. There's a lot of nuance, and there's definitely power and a need for those type of case studies. But just like Sherry's saying, it all depends, and we need as many tools as we can to manage the land.
Thank you.
Tanya, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So I was really excited to hear that, Sasha, you've had a lot of success already with Air Quality Board, giving you these sort of windows of time and giving you that sort of feedback and dialogue already, saying this is a green light time. When are you going to submit a request? And also, Jason, you mentioning that you already are seeing some support from local officials on this sort of topic of prescribed fire. And I guess my thought is kind of thinking backwards. If our goal is prescribed fire, maybe thinking about the smaller steps, and the cultural shift, if we're trying to do it, would be, to me, is like these sort of pile burning. Because if we're looking at it in the Sierra, and if we lived in a place where we're constantly aware of the threat of fire, which is the case outside of our county and other places, and we are seeing these piles being developed, and the county is going to be coming forward very quickly with a lot of fuels reduction projects. And we are moving towards addressing this biomass in a very different way. And I guess this sort of prompts me to ask, is there an opportunity for more pile burning as a form of education to the community, so that we can kind of put it in people's mindset that this is normal and this is part of the processes that are happening in our landscape, and just begin there and use that as our education campaign, like in tandem at the same time. We have the resources now, I believe, with what we're kind of creating. And so I'm happy to have anybody answer that who wants to.
I can quickly answer. I think we omitted that from the discussion today. We're doing a lot of pile burning, and a lot of it has to do with both, all the land management agencies and fire in support of that on projects. It's happening, in very favorable weather, when we have a lot of smoke distribution, sometimes even in the rain. People aren't noticing it, but it is a tool we use a lot. And it's where we can't use landscape level fire in the fall around homes or other infrastructure that the chance of or probability of escape is too high. But I think going back to what was discussed earlier, a lot of it has to do, and Sherry mentioned this, the prescription for what we're trying to do. So you can't achieve with pile burning what you can do with, landscape level burning for range management. But to your point, Tanya, I think that, use it as a training tool, use it as an opportunity close to homes. And we've done some projects right in people's backyards. And it can be effective, but we're doing quite a bit of pile burning now.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could tag on to that, much of the pile burning that our crews have been doing, by happy coincidence, have been creating biochar. And now we're learning more about biochar, and where you can work with our crews to do just slight modifications to what they're doing to create even more biochar, and then to help spread that biochar after the burn. In fact, San Rafael Fire is put in for a project for a portable biochar kiln that could be used instead of burning piles right on the ground. So it's been a tool for quite some time, but as we become more educated about a better way to do it, we're adapting to the way we do it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that the red flag days and the days that you do the burns or the pile burning are in and of itself a huge education campaign to get people aware. So thank you for sharing that.
I think that's a great point you make, Tanya. I think we at the Water District kind of think we've been doing that for years. So we've been pile burning every year, you know, as other folks have said, they've been doing it too. I mean, I know it's not all the people, Marin, but we do get a lot of visitation. So every time we do pile burnings, we do have signs out, we do have press releases. So maybe part of what you're talking about is as there's more public interest, maybe these opportunities become more megaphones, maybe the word gets further distributed. So yeah, you're right. Those are opportunities, and those opportunities become greater as there's more interest.
For Mid-Penn, you know, we started burning in the early 90s. There was a lot of pushback from our neighbors. And what really helped a lot is we provided them an opportunity to come out to one of our burns and to watch it and to see what goes on, how many people are there, what we did prior to doing the work, for them to really see like how much effort it takes. Like, you know, you hear about prescribed burns and you think, oh, they just go out there and light a match and they watch it burn. And the amount of work that goes into it is a lot. And we went from having 10 to 20 complaints per pile burn to 0 very quickly after we had that tour. So, you know, education, field visits are always, I find, hugely educational. Even to go to areas to tell them like, this is an area that we would not burn because X, Y, Z, but this is an area that we would burn. And doing education that way is very helpful.
Bill, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, great discussion. Any discussion that leads to biochar is a good thing. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there's also a timing or sequential element here that, you know, rather than thinking of prescribed burns as a single practice, it's part of a series of practices, perhaps where you remove, you know, the heavy stuff by hand, but then you move into a periodic revisiting and maintaining strategy that might involve prescribed burning on a, you know, periodic, regular basis. So I just wanted to bring that in. I think that sort of perspective may also increase its acceptability to the wider public as well.
Great. Well, if no one has any more questions, I'll pass it off to Mark and Belle for sort of some closing statements before we end for today.
And Belle, if you don't mind, I'll start and then let you close us all out.
Okay, fine.
And I would really like to thank ESP for suggesting this panel discussion. They have been hosting some excellent webinars over the last year and a half. And I probably would have never, ever thought about bringing up biochar when it comes to pile burning, except for the webinar that I attended with ESP. So I really appreciate the educational items that you guys have been putting on. Really appreciate that you suggested this specific topic and that you were willing to host it. So thank you very much. And then I would like to thank Maria for all the work that she put into this and her facilitation today. I think we can all say she did a fantastic job and we're on track time-wise. Imagine that. And so great job, Maria. And then of course, we have to thank our panel. We brought on, I hope that you'll agree with me, we brought on 6 excellent panels to talk about this. And we put a lot of effort into finding the right panelists. And I think the quality of the conversation that we had validated that. And to the panelists, I thank you for doing this in the Zoom environment and acting like you were sitting at the same table as much as you could. I felt like it was that we achieved that. And then finally, I want to thank the audience. I've been watching the amount of people that we've had, and it hasn't dwindled. So I think our content has been good. I appreciate all the people who spent 2 hours, but again, thank you to the panel for making this so interesting that no one left. And Belle, off to you.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you said and with the results. And now there's always the question, okay, well, all of these great ideas, and we have a recording, right? And I think we really, the ESP will have a look at this and pull out of it what we think would be of interest to people. And then I think maybe we should, I'll talk to Maria about this and Mark, we might want to pull together some kind of report, some kind of synthesis of what came out of it as a way of developing and helping you with any policy that you may be thinking about based on the expertise that we heard today. So that's something to think about, always one more step. And so I just want to say that we're delighted, and there were other questions, and I have one more thing to ask because Terry Thomas raised this and I didn't get to say. Is it true that California is building a prescribed fire academy? Do you know anything about that? No? It
Well,
sounds,
Bell, I mean, I think this is Jordan. Prescribed fire academies are, I wouldn't say building one, but they are things that occur, and they occur throughout the country, right? Where they're kind of a focused 2 or 3 week period, right? Where they just bring fire professionals together, aspiring prescribed fire practitioners. So it's more of a more within the fire service than it is kind of a public type fire academy, unless I know there's some other things going on with Fire Forward and some other groups, but there's a lot of interest from the state, CAL FIRE, to increase significantly the amount of acres burned, and they need to get fire professionals up to speed on practices and techniques as well. So there is a big push for that for sure.
yeah. There seems to be a lot of state pressure and interest in this subject, and so we're building on that, and also happy to have the members of the board here today.
Yeah.
It's really exciting. And so anybody have any last minute comments they want to make? Then I'd say thanks everybody for coming.
I think Sasha has some additional feedback on the fire academy type stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. The state did just pass legislature, I think it was an assembly bill, establishing that we're across the state setting up prescribed fire training centers. And those
Oh.
are not limited to people in actually with the objective training people who need to learn this skill. So it'll take time to stand that up, and I'm going to be working with the group of people who are figuring out what even the objectives for those would be and how they would look and where they would be located. But that is something that the state of California is pushing forward, and there's a pretty solid team working on developing that.
That's very good. You don't know the number of the bill, but we can find it. We'll find it.
I could send it to you. Sorry.
I'd like to follow through on that because it's
This is the Dodd bill, right, Sasha?
Weather for the state. It's good.
Sasha, this was the Dodd bill, right?
Oh, a different one.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
It's a different one. Maybe he was on that one too. It's not S. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we'll get a handle on it. Thanks.
Okay, well, great. Thank you everyone for all your time and patience, especially our panelists for the several months of hearing from me all the time in your inbox. And have a good day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks ESP and MWPA.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Well done. Well